In 1970, deep inside North Vietnam, the war had created a new kind of prison, one built not from walls but from hopelessness. Men vanished from the skies, their parachutes falling into the jungle, their names recorded as missing. Some were shot in the air, others dragged from rice fields and locked away in silence. These were the ghost soldiers, American pilots and crews captured and hidden in secret camps scattered across the north. Far from the front lines, near a small town called Son Tay, one of these camps sat under the canopy of trees. To US intelligence, it was a target glowing in the dark, a place where dozens of American POWs were believed to be held in brutal conditions. Satellite photos showed movement, shadows, figures in cages. For the men watching from half a world away, it looked like a chance to bring their brothers home. But time was running out. The prisoners were malnourished, sick, and growing weaker by the day. Reports suggested they might be executed if the war turned worse. Inside the Pentagon, a plan began to take shape, one that would break every rule of conventional warfare. The mission would be small, fast, and surgical. A handful of men, flying low and fast through the deadliest airspace on Earth, would storm the Son Tay prison, free the captives, and vanish before the enemy could react. It would be one of the most dangerous operations ever attempted, a raid so deep into enemy territory that even success might mean death. The order came from the top, Operation Ivory Coast. Every detail was classified, every participant handpicked. The men chosen were veterans of impossible missions, Green Berets, Air Force pilots, helicopter crews and intelligence officers who knew what it meant to fight in the dark. For months the planning unfolded in silence. Maps were studied under red lights. A full-scale replica of the camp was secretly built in Florida, surrounded by jungle brush trucked in to make the conditions real. Every movement, every landing, every explosion was practiced until it became muscle memory. The men didn't know where they were going, only that it would be the most dangerous night of their lives. They trained for speed, precision, and violence. Their mission would last less than an hour, but one mistake could turn it into a massacre. They learned the layout of the camp until they could move through it blindfolded. They memorised every tower, every wall, every shadow. As the date drew near, the air began to hum with unease. Hanoi was surrounded by the densest air defence system in the world. Thousands of guns, radar-guided missiles, and watchful eyes. Getting in would be nearly impossible. Getting out alive might be worse. Still, no one hesitated. To the men preparing for Son Tay, this was not a suicide mission. It was a promise. A promise to the prisoners still out there, waiting in the dark, believing that their country had forgotten them. Soon, they would find out that wasn't true. In the summer of 1970, inside a windowless room at the Pentagon, a new kind of war plan took shape. It wasn't a bombing campaign or an invasion. It was a rescue. The objective was clear. Bring home American prisoners held at the Son Tay camp, only 23 miles from Hanoi. The challenge was staggering. To reach it, the raiders would have to fly straight into the heart of enemy air defences, through radar nets, anti-aircraft guns and missiles that could erase them in seconds. The plan's architect, Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, knew what he was asking of his men. They would train for months, knowing they might never come back. Every moment of the mission was planned down to the second. The helicopters would take off from Thailand, fly low over the mountains, cross the Red River Valley, and hit the prison under the cover of night. No one outside a small circle of officers knew what was coming. The training began at a secret site in Florida. A full-scale replica of the Son Tay camp was built from reconnaissance photos. It stood hidden in the woods, surrounded by fences and floodlights. The men rehearsed again and again, day, night, rain, heat. Every assault was timed. Every shot, every turn, every breach was measured. They practiced until exhaustion blurred into instinct. To the raiders, secrecy became oxygen. They were told only what they needed to know. Their gear was stripped of markings. Their helicopters would fly in radio silence. The mission would last less than 30 minutes, but preparation took months of obsession. Every man chosen was among the best. Special forces, pilots, flight engineers, and navigators hardened by years in Vietnam. Intelligence teams fed them updates from spy planes and satellites. Photos of Son Tay showed barbed wire, watchtowers and guards. They counted 25 to 50 prisoners inside. Each face, though unseen, became a reason to push harder. The men weren't rescuing strangers. They were rescuing brothers. The final brief came in late autumn. A storm system would cover their approach. Perfect for concealment, deadly for flying. They would go anyway. The assault force would launch from Udon Air Base in Thailand under total blackout. The flight path was a razor's edge. Too high, and radar would catch them. Too low, and the jungle would eat them alive. Inside the barracks, the men packed their gear quietly. No letters home. No goodbyes. They moved with the stillness of men who had already made peace with what might come. Every helicopter was assigned its role. One to crash through the front gate, one to drop the assault team, one to secure the perimeter, one to extract. Timing had to be perfect. If one aircraft missed its mark, the entire mission would collapse. When the final inspection ended, Simons gathered his team. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just a look that said everything. The mission was green. In a few days, the most daring rescue of the Vietnam War would begin, and no one outside that room would know until it was already over. November 21st, 1970. The air over Thailand was heavy with silence. In the dark, the men of Operation Ivory Coast moved like ghosts, loading their gear, checking weapons, strapping into their seats. The blades of their helicopters began to turn, slow at first, then faster, until the night filled with a low metallic thunder. One by one, the aircraft lifted into the black sky, their running lights darkened. It was 2 a.m. They were heading straight for North Vietnam. There were no guarantees, only coordinates and courage. Ahead of them stretched hundreds of miles of enemy territory, guarded by the most lethal air defence network on Earth. Soviet-built radar swept the skies, waiting for intruders. Anti-aircraft batteries lined the valleys. Missiles stood ready in the fields. No American aircraft had ever flown this deep without heavy losses. Yet tonight they would go in with no fighter escort, no second chances. The formation of helicopters flew low, skimming the jungle canopy, hugging the terrain to stay below radar. Every man aboard felt the vibration of the engines through his bones. The air smelled of fuel and sweat. In the dim red glow inside the cabin, faces were tight, eyes unblinking. Each man carried enough ammunition for a small war, and the knowledge that they might never fire a single shot in victory. Above them, the night sky flickered with lightning. A storm front rolled across the mountains, exactly as planned. It would mask their approach, but it also turned flying into a knife fight with nature. The pilots wrestled with turbulence, the rotors slicing through rain and wind. Instruments shook. Compass needles danced. Still, they pressed on, flying blind through the black void. The lead aircraft carried Colonel Simons and the main assault team. Every minute of flight was calculated, every second rehearsed. Radio silence held. No one spoke. Every click of a switch, every movement was deliberate. They flew through valleys so low the treetops brushed their landing skids. One wrong move and the jungle would tear them apart. Behind them, transport planes and fighter jets joined the deception effort, drawing enemy radar and firing up false signals. The North Vietnamese defences came alive, chasing ghosts on their screens, unaware that the real threat was already slipping through the cracks. After nearly 3 hours in the air, the first glimmer of the Red River shimmered beneath them. They were in enemy territory now. The lights of Hanoi burned faintly on the horizon, a reminder of how deep they'd gone. Ahead lay Son Tay, a small cluster of buildings surrounded by walls, trees and silence. In the distance, flashes of anti-aircraft fire erupted as radar picked up the approaching formation. The helicopters dropped even lower, their pilots steady and unflinching. The assault team braced themselves. Their mission was about to begin. No one spoke a word. The only sound was the roar of the rotors and the pounding of hearts. They were flying into the centre of hell, and they were doing it for men they had never met. The night over, Son Tay burned alive. The first helicopter dropped out of the clouds like a falling star, its pilot aiming straight for the prison courtyard. At the last second, the aircraft slammed through the camp's guard tower, a planned impact meant to break the perimeter and shock the defenders. The explosion tore the silence apart. Flames and debris scattered across the compound as Green Berets leapt from the wreckage, weapons up, hearts pounding. The raid had begun. Seconds later, the rest of the formation roared in behind them, engines screaming in the humid air. The command chopper hovered above the treetops, guiding the teams through the chaos. Tracer fire erupted from the surrounding jungle, streaks of red cutting through the dark. The raiders answered with precision bursts, silencing the towers one by one. Colonel Simon's team hit the ground running. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Night vision goggles glowed green as the men sprinted through the gates, clearing one building after another. Explosions from grenades echoed across the camp. Every second mattered. They had less than 30 minutes to find the prisoners and get out before North Vietnamese reinforcements arrived. Inside the compound, everything went exactly as rehearsed. The assault teams swept through the barracks, kicked open cell doors, shouted for captives. But something was wrong. There were no voices, no movement, no chains rattling in the dark. The cells were empty, perfectly arranged, beds neatly lined, no sign of life. The realisation spread like a cold wave through the team. They searched again, faster this time, breaking locks, overturning mattresses, scanning the corners with flashlights. Nothing. The prisoners they had come to save were gone. Outside, the perimeter teams held their positions. A nearby building erupted in gunfire as enemy soldiers tried to approach, but the raiders cut them down before they reached the gate. From above, the rescue helicopters circled in tight orbits, keeping the extraction route clear. The radios crackled with short coded bursts. The message was grim. No POWs found. Colonel Simons gave the order to regroup. What had been a flawless assault now felt like a nightmare. Every man had trained for the sound of grateful captives being pulled from cells, not the echo of emptiness. Still, the mission had to continue. They gathered the intelligence materials they could find, planted charges to destroy the camp, and prepared to pull out. As they loaded back into the helicopters, the surrounding jungle lit up with enemy gunfire. Anti-aircraft tracers clawed at the night sky. The pilots lifted the aircraft into the air, banking hard toward the extraction route. Bullets tore through the darkness, but the formation stayed tight. Below them, the Son Tay prison burned, a beacon of fire in the endless jungle. The mission had gone perfectly. The execution was flawless. But there were no prisoners, only ghosts. The men had stormed a camp that had been abandoned, days before they arrived. As the helicopters thundered away from Son Tay, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Months of planning, thousands of miles flown, and one of the most daring operations of the entire war, all for a prison with no prisoners. The radio was silent, except for brief, clipped commands. No one spoke about what they had just seen. No one wanted to. When the assault teams regrouped at altitude, the emotion inside the aircraft was something between disbelief and grief. They had done everything right. Every shot, every movement, every second of the plan had unfolded with precision. But in the centre of that perfection, the objective had vanished. Hours later, the first helicopters touched down at Udon Air Base in Thailand. Ground crews rushed to refuel and assist, expecting to see rescued POWs step out into the floodlights. Instead, they saw the same faces that had left hours earlier, streaked with sweat and smoke, eyes hollow from what they'd found. The silence that followed was worse than failure. It was confusion. When Colonel Simon stepped off the aircraft, he already knew what the intelligence officers would say. The prisoners had been moved days earlier. Aerial surveillance had shown them there in early November, but the most recent recon photos had been delayed. Weather, timing, secrecy, all the elements that had made the raid possible had also hidden the truth. The POWs had been transferred to another facility, possibly because of flooding in the Son Tay area. Nobody in command had known. The irony was brutal. The raid had been perfect, but its timing had betrayed it. In the following hours, the men gathered in a dimly lit hangar for debriefing. Maps, photos, and documents covered the tables. Intelligence officers traced their routes, measured distances, asked mechanical questions that could not fix what had gone wrong. The soldiers sat quietly, still wearing the grime of battle. Some stared at the floor. Others replayed the mission in their heads, searching for something to blame. There was nothing. For Simons and his men, the knowledge that they had risked everything and lost nothing but time was hard to bear. But slowly, a different understanding began to take shape. They had not been defeated. They had done something extraordinary. They had flown deep into enemy territory, landed in the shadow of Hanoi, and escaped alive without losing a single man. Back in Washington, the reaction was mixed. Some called the mission a failure. Others saw it as proof of American daring and precision. Behind closed doors, senior commanders quietly praised the raid as a technical triumph. If the prisoners had still been there, every one of them would have been brought home. The system had worked, only fate had failed them. For the men who had gone through it, that was little comfort. The faces of the missing POWs, the men they had trained to rescue, lingered in every mind. They had gone to the edge of death for their brothers, and arrived only to find empty beds and cold air. They had gone looking for life and found silence. Still, deep down, every man knew one thing. If given the order again, they would have gone back. The flight back from Son Tay was supposed to be quiet, but the sky had other plans. Within minutes of leaving the target, enemy searchlights and anti-aircraft guns came alive across the Red River Valley. The jungle below erupted with fire. Tracers streaked upward, weaving a deadly web through the clouds. The helicopters, heavy with fuel and men, were easy targets. The pilots flew like ghosts, cutting through valleys so low that the rotor blades nearly skimmed the treetops. The aircraft jolted with every burst of turbulence, every near miss. The roar of engines and gunfire merged into a single, endless sound. One mistake, one flash of panic, and they'd be torn apart by missiles. Above them, C-130 flare ships dropped brilliant trails of light, drawing enemy fire away from the formation. The pilots called it flying through daylight. The sky turned white as hundreds of flares burned overhead, lighting up the terrain in every direction. The raiders could see the fields, the rivers, even the distant glow of Hanoi, and the anti-aircraft guns firing relentlessly from its outskirts. Colonel Simons's lead helicopter weaved through the chaos, guiding the others by instinct and sheer will. The crew inside barely breathed. Every second stretched like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sky went dark again. The formation broke through the final ring of defences and banked toward Laos. Behind them, the flares faded and the gunfire died away. They had escaped. When they crossed into friendly airspace, a wave of silence filled the cabins. Some men slumped in their seats, others stared blankly at the jungle below. They had done it. Flown into the most heavily defended airspace in the world and made it out alive. No casualties, no aircraft lost. The impossible had just been done. By the time they reached Udon Air Base, the first light of dawn was breaking. The helicopters touched down in perfect formation, one after another, their fuselages scarred with bullet holes. Ground crews rushed forward as the engines powered down, but the raiders stayed seated for a long moment, letting the realisation sink in. They had gone into hell and come back. But the men they came for were still prisoners, somewhere in the north. That truth was harder to face than any gunfire. The base erupted in controlled chaos, officers scrambling for debriefs, intelligence teams poring over maps, flight crews checking damage. Simons moved quietly among his men, offering a nod here, a pat on the shoulder there. No speeches, just understanding. They had done their job. Word of the raid reached Washington before sunrise. The Pentagon was stunned. Not by failure, but by the precision and bravery of the operation. In private briefings, commanders called it flawless execution. They marvelled at how close the team had come to pulling off one of the most daring rescues in modern warfare. But for the men who had been there, the headlines meant nothing. They had seen the empty cells. They had heard the silence where voices should have been. They had brought back proof that America would go to the ends of the earth for its captured sons, even if they weren't there to see it. In the days following the raid, the world learned what had happened, or rather, what hadn't. The Son Tay rescue had struck deep into the heart of North Vietnam, stunned the enemy, and left without a single American casualty. Yet no prisoners had been found. Newspapers called it a failure. Washington called it a success. For the men who had risked everything, it was something harder to define. Inside the Pentagon, the mood was conflicted. Operation Ivory Coast had demonstrated the reach and precision of American special operations. It had also exposed the limits of intelligence in a war fought through fog and guesswork. The plan had worked perfectly, but the timing had betrayed it. The prisoners had been moved just days earlier, possibly to a camp less than 15 miles away. The irony was brutal. While the raid unfolded, the very men it was meant to save could hear the explosions from their new prison. Some POWs later recalled seeing the flash of flares and tracer fire on the horizon, unaware that the rescue they'd prayed for was happening just beyond reach. North Vietnam scrambled to understand what had hit them. The raid had unfolded faster than any defence system could react. Guards fled their posts, commanders panicked, and the streets of Hanoi buzzed with confusion. For a few hours, no one knew whether an invasion had begun. The boldness of the attack sent shockwaves through both armies. For the prisoners still held in captivity, the effects were immediate and profound. Within weeks, they began receiving better food, medical attention, and collective housing. The raid had terrified their captors, proof that America was willing to send men into the jaws of death for its own. Even though the rescue had failed to bring anyone home, it had saved lives all the same. In the United States, the story spread quickly. Television networks aired footage of returning helicopters and grim-faced soldiers stepping off in silence. The press was divided. Some hailed the men as heroes, others questioned the cost of risking so many for so few. But among the ranks of the military, the raid became legend. It was studied, dissected, and eventually immortalised in training manuals as the perfect operation that had failed only by fate. Colonel Simons refused to see it as defeat. In private briefings, he described it as the right thing done the right way. The men who flew with him agreed they had done their duty, and more. They had proven that courage could reach where politics could not. The raid's influence spread quietly through the decades. It shaped future operations, from hostage rescues in the Middle East to modern special forces doctrine. The lessons of Son Tay became the foundation for America's elite units. Precision, secrecy, and the unshakable will to bring their people home. Yet for the raiders themselves, the legacy was personal. Many returned to civilian life without fanfare, carrying memories they could never quite set down. The sight of the empty camp, the feeling of being too late. Some spoke about it years later, most never did. They had risked everything for their brothers, and though they hadn't found them, they had shown the world what that bond meant. Son Tay was supposed to be a rescue. Instead, it became a testament to courage, precision, and the unbearable price of coming up short. Years passed, but the night of the Son Tay raid never really ended. For the men who flew into the heart of North Vietnam and returned with nothing but silence, that mission lived on in their dreams, replayed in flashes of green light, gunfire, and the echo of empty cells. They had risked everything to rescue ghosts, and those ghosts never left them. When the prisoners of war were finally released years later, many heard the story for the first time. They learned that on that November night, American helicopters had come within minutes of their new prison, that the distant thunder they'd heard wasn't bombing, but the sound of men coming for them. Some wept when they realised how close rescue had come. Others said the knowledge gave them peace. Even in the darkest days of captivity, they had never been forgotten. For the US military, Son Tay became more than an operation. It became a lesson written in courage. The raid changed how special operations were planned and executed. Every second, every movement, every risk taken that night became the blueprint for the elite missions that followed. From hostage rescues to modern covert warfare, the fingerprints of Son Tay were everywhere. Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, the man who led it all, never called it a failure. To him, it was the proudest mission of his life, not because of the outcome, but because of the men who went with him. They had flown into the most defended airspace on Earth, landed within sight of Hanoi, fought with precision, and brought everyone of their own home. That was victory enough. Decades later, those who survived the raid gathered quietly from time to time. No headlines, no speeches, just men remembering a night when courage meant flying into certain death for people they had never met. They didn't talk about medals or politics. They talked about duty, loyalty, and the sound of rotors beating in the dark. The Son Tay raid remains one of the most extraordinary missions in modern military history. It failed on paper, but in spirit it became immortal. It proved that valour is not measured in success, but in the willingness to act when the world says it's impossible. The ghosts of Son Tay still whisper through history, not in triumph, but in quiet defiance. They remind us that even when rescue never comes, the attempt itself is what defines us. If you made it this far, thank you for walking this road with us. If you love stories like this, true stories about courage, endurance, and forgotten history, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and tap the hype button so more people can discover them too. Until next time, keep your head low, your spirit high, and remember the night when heroes flew into the dark for the men who never came home.